Aloha mai kako, everyone. Welcome to episode 51 of the Moana Nui podcast. We are in the last week of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander month, and we are so excited to finish the month strong. Today, we have some great and wonderful content that we are bringing to you all. My name is Moana, the founder of the Moana Nui podcast here. I am also the author of the Adventures of Nakoa and Nohea children's book series, editor of the Wildcard Chronicles comic book series, publisher at Burning Spear Comics, and champion and advocate for the indigenous communities. Tonight, I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Dana.
Aloha, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're so excited to have this next episode. But for those that may or may not know me, I am Dana. I am a cosplay event and staff con photographer. You may have seen some of my photographs with MomoCon, Dragon Con, Anime Week in Atlanta, and even with DC Comics. I'm also a voice actor, event planner, and a whole lot more. And now I'm going to hand it back over to my beautiful co-host, the lovely Moana.
Alrighty, so before we get started tonight, just two quick announcements of some projects that we want to make you guys aware of. For those of you who may or may not know, we are the sponsor of the Chat and Draw podcast hosted by our wonderful friend Mike Watson, and he has a campaign live on Kickstarter right now called Hot Shot. The Hot Shot Collection is the name of the project, and we will drop that here in the comments during the show tonight. So please go and check that out. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, one more quick announcement for Joystick Angels. Joystick Angels is another project live on Kickstarter right now by a friend of the podcast and a friend of mine for sure, TJ Sterling at Ray Comics. So please be sure to check out Joystick Angels, a space-based adventure that I think everyone will enjoy. Mm-hmm. All righty. So let me announce our wonderful guest tonight. I'm super excited. I have learned so much from Keawe, and I'm really honored that he agreed to come onto the to podcast and share with us his mana'o and his just deep knowledge of not just Hawaiian history, but indigenous history. So Adam Keawe Manalo-Camp is a Native Hawaiian cultural historian with roots in both Papakolea Homestead and in the Philippines. He's also a writer, blogger, and researcher who writes from a Hawaiian point of view and perspective, which is valued and treasured by so many in our community. So let us bring him on and welcome him to the show. Aloha.
Aloha.
Mahalo nui for being here with us tonight. Let's get started with, we typically like to go to the piko or your origins. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where did you grow up and what was your childhood like?
Well, I grew up in Papakolea Hawaiian Homestead on the island of Oahu. However, my family is originally from the island of Hawaii, particularly from Hamakua, Kohala, and Kona. I was brought up by my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1900. So she was an utter wealth of knowledge.
Yes.
And I went to public school all the way. Contrary to what some people have been saying, I did not go to Kamehameha schools. I went to Lincoln, Stevenson, Roosevelt. So yeah, I'm a product of public school. So as far as like my childhood, as I mentioned, I was brought up by my grandmother. In the household, Hawaiian was the primary language. However, when I had to go to school and anywhere outside the house, of course, English was the language that was used. And I actually still have a lot of trauma about that. Like I still remember, the first day of kindergarten where I was in a classroom with a bunch of kids, and I could not understand them. And my teacher gave up on trying to communicate with me, and she sent me home. And then the school decided that I needed to go to English as a second language class, and I was in ESL for 4 years. And as a result of how much I hated ESL class,
Mm,
I lost a lot of my Hawaiian language skills
mm,
growing up because of that, because I was trying to fit in and I was trying to accommodate, being in the outside world at school. And
mm,
also, that's how it was for a lot of kids,
mhm,
where English was, you had to learn the colonial language. And my grandmother had worse, much, much worse experiences than I. My mother had worse experiences than I. I mean, my grandmother was beaten for speaking Hawaiian. Um, she had a scar on her left hand from a teacher that she had in the third grade because she was caught speaking Hawaiian. And the teacher gave her uh, a, a whooping with a metric ruler, and it hit her hand so hard that even though when she passed away at 93 years old, she still had the scar from left on her left hand by her teacher for speaking in her native language in her native homeland. And I think about these experiences of my grandmother, my mother, and myself, and I am glad that the younger generation has experience now to be able to be Hawaiian in their own homeland or try to be Hawaiian in
yeah,
their own homeland. Because the reality is in Hawaii, a Hawaiian can be an engineer, a doctor, a teacher, a professor. But the only thing that a Hawaiian cannot truly be is Hawaiian.
mhm,
I'm so that's such a great point of view. I was,
Yeah.
already thinking about like as you were saying that, I was like, yep, the only thing we cannot be is Hawaiian. And I'm glad that you mentioned how our ancestors were treated and beaten for speaking our native language. And
mhm,
it's like a generational trauma that a lot of us experience, but may not have known what it really was. Right? We don't have the terms that we now have. Um, so mahalo nui for sharing that. I know it's tough to talk about these things too.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And of course, within the Hawaiian community, we have a deep appreciation and respect for a kupuna. Can you tell us about someone who has the biggest influence in your life and what lessons did that person teach you?
Do you mean within my family or outside?
It could be
Mm,
either. Yeah.
oh, either one.
Uh, the person who had the biggest impact on me is actually my grandmother who
Mhm,
raised me. Um, because I think about all of the struggles that she went through.
mhm,
I mean, she was born in
yes,
1900. She attended Queen Liliuokalani's funeral.
Wow.
Um, she saw Hawaii develop from the territory until the state.
mhm,
Hmm.
The year that she died, there was the Unipa'a March at Iolani Palace, marking the 100th anniversary of the overthrow,
oh,
um, the illegal overthrow, excuse me. And being a woman, being a woman of color,
mhm,
growing up during that climate, I cannot fathom how much she had to go through. And she was by profession a nurse, and she went to UH actually for nursing. She was one of the few Hawaiians at the time who graduated from UH, and yeah, and she cared for people, and she never, despite the obstacles that she had faced, she never gave up on being Hawaiian,
Mm,
and that's probably something that I take with me
mhm.
because whenever I go through one of my if whenever I'm struggling with something, I just think about the strength that I have inherited
Yes.
from my grandparents.
Mhm.
Oh, I love that so much. You're definitely echoing, the way I view the strength of my kupuna as well. And I often think, like, when we are dealing with the challenges, it's actually a kuleana to like not let those things, bog us down, because it's a way for us to pay respect and honor to them,
Yes.
continuously, and continue on their legacy and the things that they wanted for us. So wow. When you said, like 1900, I was like, oh man, so she was like
Mhm.
right in the midst of
Yes.
everything
Mhm.
that was pivotal to, the that well, like you said, the illegal overthrow, and how the
Mhm.
landscape of Hawaii changed throughout her lifetime. What a blessing to
Yes,
have her.
but she also had a lot of, like many Hawaiians, she also had a lot of trauma from
Yes.
that. Her father was imprisoned by the Republic of Hawaii for participating in the 1895 uprising.
Hmm.
Her mother was wrongfully sent to Molokai, where she caught leprosy because they misdiagnosed her. Um, but like her father, I read through his letters. So my father is the grandson. Her father was the grandson of George Pilipo, who was a legislator in the Hawaiian Kingdom for 20 years.
Mhm.
Um, his son became secretary to Princess Ruth
Ah.
Ke'inikolani.
Hmm.
So there's those connections. And as mentioned, I think in the National Geographic article, my family is connected one way or another, either through employment or through station, to Iolani Palace for the last 5 generations.
Mhm.
So, I mean, my grandmother's mother was actually a lady in waiting in 1892, right
Wow.
when the queen was going through everything, the whole mess
Wow.
of right before the overthrow. So the overthrow for them, just like many other Hawaiians, was deeply personal. And it
Hmm.
wasn't just some sort of abstract political coup. It was deeply personal. It was
Mhm.
spiritual. It was also economic. Um, my family, lost a lot of lands due to quiet titling and eminent domain during the territorial era because that was happening a lot to Hawaiians. Yeah, so I, as like other indigenous people, we have, as Native Hawaiians, gone through so much.
Mhm.
And we also need to remember that our ancestors suffered, but they
Yes.
suffered in the hopes that we could rebuild what they had lost.
Yes.
Yes, that's a great point. And
Mhm.
I love the theme that I'm hearing here are the wonderful women, in Hawaiian culture who played such important roles, in our daily life and within our culture. And, in a lot of the conversations around diversity today, there's a lot of talk about seeking equality for women,
Mhm.
because historically, the patriarchal society of the United States has too often limited women's rights and views. Um, but on the flip side, when you look at the different indigenous cultures around the world, women, as you mentioned, have held critical roles in the culture And in your research that you share with us, you celebrate many of the matriarchs in Pacific Islander society. Can you share with our audience a bit about this and who are some of your favorite women leaders, role models, and why?
So sometimes as Hawaiians, we're kind of obsessed with the li'i structure,
Mm-hmm.
which is predominantly written by the history is written by men who were part of that structure. We don't actually know a lot about the history of the Maka'aina na, the common people, because most of the common people were wiped away with the foreign diseases that swept
Mhm.
upon the lands um,
Yes.
in the early part of the 19th century. And um, the structure of these Makainana were very much centered on women. And even within the Li'i structure itself, the only hereditary titles that existed through a matrilineal, through the matriarchal line.
Mhm.
Um, men's titles could be fought over, could be divested, could be invested, but the titles held by women were passed on.
Yeah.
Um, because they're as women, as wahine, uh, they hold both the past and the future.
Yes.
And I think sometimes in the way, because we have been so influenced by colonization,
Yes.
we leave out a lot of these informations concerning women and their
Mhm.
role and how they fit into Hawaiian society, both pre contact
Yes.
and today.
Mhm.
And as I think I mentioned several times in some of my posts, women in Hawaiian history are
Yes.
usually the catalysts for change.
Mhm.
So on one hand, they are the makers of change, but on the other hand, they also hold tradition. And to a Western mind, that might sound, contradictory, but it's
Yes.
not in the Hawaiian mind. Because
Mhm.
if you know your traditions very well, you would understand that there's some traditions that do need to change, and that there is room and space for change within tradition.
Mhm.
Um, so there's that. As far as women that I admire, there's a lot, but I think one of the political figures that I admire is Emma Navahi, who was a journalist. She was a editor. She was, of course, the wife of Joseph Navahi, but also she was politically active throughout her life. And people kind of skip over, what happened to her after 1897. But even after 1897, she was still going strong all the way to
Mhm.
the 1930s. She helped to organize labor unions. She joined in strikes against the sugar planters. She helped to organize FDR's visit to Hawaii, and it was largely because of her criticisms that FDR um, pushed for the restoration of Iolani Palace. Of course, that didn't actually happen. They restored one room, the throne room. It didn't. It took another what 40 years before the palace would be restored. But that set into motion
Mhm.
um, the preservation of the palace. She also was deeply Hawaiian and centered herself within something that she had a drive to be Hawaiian.
Mhm.
At the same time, she also had a drive to learn things from the outside world. Like she was also fluent in Chinese, um, and she was an avid book reader. She read huge amounts of books from different subjects. So she was very akamai in her own right. And one of the touching stories I think about too is when her husband was on his deathbed in San Francisco, because he had contracted TB from being imprisoned. Um, his last words to his wife was that he just kept on apologizing to her for forcing her to come so far away from her homeland, and how he admired her dedication to Hawaii, and how sorry he was that he was going to probably die so far away from the land that she had loved and that they had loved.
Goodness. Oh, that's hearing that story. Oh my gosh. Okay. um, definitely. When you go in Hawaiian culture, our view of gender roles is unique and accepting. Particularly, we have the concept of mahu, which is someone who is in the middle. Kumu and Hina did a great documentary called A Place in the Middle that um, we thoroughly enjoyed. Can you share with us a bit about the importance of Mahu and the cultural and spiritual value it has for the Kanaka Maole?
Sure. So mahu can mean many things. It can mean someone who's gay, homosexual. It can mean someone who is transgender. It could mean someone who is more pansexual, I guess. There's a lot of definitions that is possible within the context of mahu. And what that does is it creates a unique space for people who are mahu. Like I consider myself to be mahu,
Mhm.
to be able to go between uh, spaces that were designed for kane and spaces that were designed for wahine. At
Mhm.
the same time, it speaks to our ancestors, not seeing gender roles or gender itself as necessarily being binary.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I personally think of Mahu as being more of a gender unto itself, as a third gender,
Mhm.
not so
Mhm.
much being as somewhere in the middle.
Yes.
But I understand that point of view. With that comes a certain kuleana. And what I mean by that is that I understand that people say that that is a spiritual role. And I agree with that. But at the same time, uh, we need to also look at it from a cultural perspective,
Mhm.
which is that Mahu were able to preserve traditions from the Wahine and the men. And
Mhm.
they were also able to um, provoke thought about the binary identities and about sexuality itself.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I've often found that like as a child, you know, mahu, at least the way it was explained to me, right, and not having the full Hawaiian cultural perspective,
Yeah.
but was more like along the gay lines and not necessarily from the cultural perspective in terms of like bridging, you know, being able to bridge. Um, for me, I feel like it's kind of like I don't know, like a affinity in a way, like
Mhm.
because I mean there are times like I don't consider myself mahu, but I do feel that there are spaces that I mean I generally like tend to go to more masculine spaces, like in terms of
Mhm.
like who I surround myself with, and I don't know what where that comes from. It's just natural to me, like
Yes.
to be the project the strength part, like being a champion for the people, like many of our vahine, right?
Mhm.
In our culture. So um I'm really glad we got to get your perspective on that because
Yes.
I think it's not a simple concept at all.
Exactly. Because I love the fact you brought that up, Moana, because I know not only for the Hawaiian portion, but I know for my grandmother from the Native American perspective, it has that similar
Hmm.
connection, which I learned growing up, that it's considered um, fluidity, that gender is a social construct that was put on us by colonization,
Yes.
but both the Native Hawaiians and Native Americans considered it more fluid in our approach and who we are. And I always considered it as a fluidity and all that we get. Some of us have um, like was said, a little bit of both areas, or some may lean more towards one, lean towards another, but it's that fluidness that we flow between the energies of both both spectrums.
Hmm. Yeah. Now, regardless of how we, individually or collectively view ourselves from a gender perspective,
Hmm.
we still find that because of the way we've been brought up at least we've observed across many indigenous cultures that we're taught to be humble and not necessarily speak up about the things that we have or how we may feel about an issue or telling our own story.
Yes.
And for a lot of us it's taking some time to find our voices and be brave enough to use them.
Yes.
So, when, Keawe, do you think that this happened for you? And what advice would you offer to those who are still not comfortable speaking out and advocating for themselves or others?
Hmm.
Well, I think that's a struggle because sometimes, even if you are ma'a or familiar with Hawaiian culture, there are areas where you have to really think if it's really Hawaiian culture or if it's a throwback to the missionaries, essentially.
Hmm.
And like for example, I heard you speaking about strength and about women speaking out and stuff like that. That is a very traditional Hawaiian role for women. Um, but in the West, of course, women are expected to be subservient, smile, bear children. But in the Hawaiian perspective, um, that is not necessarily the case. Women, for example, had multiple partners, both male and female. Um, Women could hold political power in their own right, and several Hawaiian women prior to Kamehameha the First were, basically the li'inui of their island. Oahu, for example, has had three female ali'i nui. So, yes, colonization really screwed us up
Yes.
and screwed up particularly the role of women. Because again, you look at Kamehameha the First, he passed away, and uh, Ka'ahumanu becomes Kuhina Nui, and his son Liho Liho becomes Kamehameha the Second. But
Hmm.
when it was announced that they would share power, no one said anything about Kahumanu's gender. There
Hmm.
was no concern about that. And in fact, it was seen as being relatively reasonable because Liho Liho was so young and Kahumanu was a political machine in her own right. Um, so, again, when we're talking about the role of women, Hawaiian women in particular,
Mhm.
We need to also clarify that women were the artists, women were the activists, women were the connection between the land and the people. So I
Yes.
don't necessarily see a female activist as being something that is mm, culturally incorrect. To me,
Mhm.
that is very much a part of our culture.
Yes.
Women have to uh, some they need to speak out
Hmm.
because they're the ones who straighten up the lahui.
Mhm.
Right.
So, as far as advice for speaking out, I think one has to figure out what their kuleana is.
Mm.
Mhm.
What is the thing that motivates you? What
Yes.
is what are the issues that really wrench your gut?
Mhm.
And then you have to figure out what is the appropriate role that you feel that you can get into.
Okay.
Because not everyone has to be, the type person who organizes a rally.
Mm.
Rallies are good, but not everyone has that type of skill.
Yes.
Some people, their skill is to make posters for the rally. Some
Mhm.
people, they may not be able to attend the rally, but they can write, letters in support.
Mhm.
You know, it depends on what they feel that their kuleana is and what they can handle mentally, physically, and spiritually at that time.
Mhm. Definitely, it's great points that you brought out right there. And one thing that one of the things that we admire about your work is that you seek balance viewpoints. As a Kanaka, you are not afraid to call out the imperfections within our community. For example, you have advocated for the Micronesian community within Hawaii and called out our local communities for their prejudices against our cousins. How have the community on both sides responded to that?
Micronesians are generally supportive. Uh,
Mhm.
I get messages from Micronesians thanking me, and I
Mhm.
feel awkward um, with that sometimes. I appreciate it, but I also feel
Yeah.
awkward because I feel like I shouldn't have to be the one who is so vocal about these
Mhm.
issues.
Yes.
I feel like as a Pacific Islander community, as an indigenous community, as someone who was, as a people that were also affected by American colonization,
Yes.
we should be more supportive. I mean,
Mhm.
Yes.
it should
Yes.
be a no brainer,
Hmm.
Yes.
but it's not. And
Mhm.
I don't know. There's a fear of brownness with the Micronesians. I don't know. Um, I mean, and when I mean by that, I mean there is, issues of colorism
Hmm.
within our community. Because
Yeah.
I also see the way that some people in our community, and this is not to bash our community, I want to state that every community has issues.
Absolutely. Hmm.
But even in how we deal with our black
Hmm.
brothers and sisters,
Yeah.
uh, like in the recent Black Lives Matter
Mhm.
movement, there were times where I just was shaking my head, and because again, um, I see. So I don't particularly advocate for just sovereignty.
Hmm.
Mhm.
I actually believe strongly in liberation, and
Mhm.
I believe that liberation is a collective
Yes.
matter. As long as if we have oppressed people, as long as if there are inequalities
Hmm.
within our own society and
Yes.
within our neighbors, within the world,
Right.
Mhm.
we need to tear them down.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love that because I mean, we were just talking about this on another panel in terms of like unifying, across across cultures and breaking down the systems essentially of white supremacy and colonialization, because we're all experiencing the same effects and traumas of it. And I'm also glad that you brought up the colorism thing, because I have seen that within even my own family, sadly, like, and I think it's because we've lost so much, whether it be culturally or even our own self-identity and what our ancestors, look like how, to me, like, criticizing or discriminating against, popolo, Black people, African Americans, to me, it's like doing the same thing to our kupuna, because we have roots in that too, so I'm so glad that you brought up those issues. It's, doing all the things that we do, we've heard that the colorism aspect being a huge part of not just, the general conversation, but experiences amongst, those within our community as well. Yeah. Let's see. So, I mean, I don't know if you consider yourself an activist, but I feel like you are, because you speak out for so many communities, not just the Native Hawaiian community, but, like Austronesian, communities. And as you mentioned, like around the world, regardless of where we are. So, but doing this work, it can be exhausting, right? Especially like in this era is what I'm trying to say. Era of social media, where like people are constantly like commenting and spewing whatever it might be, whether it's good, bad, indifferent, whatever. But you have weathered the storms with strength and grace. How do you recharge to continue your important work and not get just overwhelmed by everything?
Yes.
Well, emotionally, to be perfectly honest, what drains me is having to argue with people from my own community.
Oh, yes.
Like, I can handle white supremacists and stuff like that. Like, I've gotten death threats from the Proud Boys and stuff like that before. I can handle that. What I don't like is having to argue with another Hawaiian, especially when their viewpoint is centered on white supremacist points. And there was a period of time, when I read through some of the Hawaii News Now comments or Civil Beat comments, some comments made by Hawaiian sounding names sound exactly like white supremacist talking points.
Yep.
This replaced Micronesian with black, or replace black with black. Like with the Lindani shooting. Yeah, so that drains me a lot. And I've just learned, to be honest, I don't really post anymore to educate the general population. I post to help reaffirm and recharge people who are actually thinking about these issues. Because the truth of the matter is, especially in social media, most times you will not be able to change someone's mind. Um, so there's no real point to having a debate on social media.
Yes.
But there's a lot of people who are thinking about these issues, or are thinking that they are a voice, alone in the wilderness. And I like to point out these issues so that way people know that they're not alone in their thinking, and that there is a community, or there are voices in the community that resound in a similar way to their own.
Yes.
Yeah, and mahalo for being that voice, because I know it has definitely reached my wilderness.
Yes.
And I'm actually glad that you brought up the point about having to have arguments within your own community. I've noticed that not just within Hawaiians, but within other communities of color. And my husband and I talk about this a lot. But what triggered in my mind when you said that was like the struggle I sometimes have because I am, not many Hawaiians would travel away from home so far, like by themselves without a family, right? Like I traveled, to the East Coast when I was young. And so my experiences have broadened, right? Like, and I've seen more things. Um, and sometimes, when I've had conversations with friends back home, it's really hard to get them out of their, I don't know, I'm not knocking them, but like somewhat of a sheltered mindset in because they only see, like what is around them, right? And the experience, and they don't know what it's like to be a Hawaiian out, in by yourself, like on your own va'a, paddling by yourself, right?
Yes.
And so yeah, it's definitely challenging to help them see like a different mindset too.
Yes.
I think it's also important to remember that uh, at the time of the overthrow, we had 70 newspapers, and literacy was basically universal. Actually, Hawaii and Scotland were the
Yes.
only two places in the world that had universal literacy. Today, literacy in Hawaii, I think, is at 83%.
Wow.
In terms of American school systems,
Mm-hmm.
we rank 48, I think, out of
Mm-hmm.
51.
Mm-hmm.
There has been a great loss of education and intellectual inquiry that came with American colonization.
Yes.
We were smarter, our ancestors were actually smarter than us in some
Mm-hmm.
cases. Um, when you read Hawaiian language newspapers, you see Hawaiians in South Africa talking about life there. You see Hawaiians in the Marquesas talking about life there. There's letters from Hawaiians in Manila and in London and in Rome talking about life there.
Yes.
Hawaiians were intellectually curious in the 19th century,
Yes.
and most of them were bilingual. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
for Americans, being bilingual is seen as a dirty thing unless you're rich. Um, but for most of the world, being bilingual and being open to looking at other ways of life is considered to be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But in the US, it's not because America is number one. I mean, we have to look at the chaos that was created last year with the coronavirus. There was such a lack of basic
Yes.
health education,
Mm-hmm.
and that stems from defunding the public school system for the last 30 years. And in our case, in Hawaii, it comes from the fact that we're basically a colony, and our education system is only to support the tourism industry.
Yes. Amazing points.
Yes.
we could go down a whole panel on that. We're gonna make a note, Nate, Dana. We're gonna have Adam back on that panel. Yes, education. Let's talk about it. Lord have mercy.
Oh, yes, goodness. Oh, but another beauty of your research, and you cover indigenous people and cultures from all over the world, not just Hawaii. Have you discovered a connection between the Caribbean island cultures and the Pacific island cultures?
That's a very good question. Uh, this is a problem with documentation, and this is where oral history needs to come up more
Hmm.
because of the fact. So, like for example, with people from I forgot the English name for it. Cape Verde. I was thinking about the Portuguese name.
Mm-hmm.
There's there was a lot of Cape Verdeans in Hawaii in the 1830s and 40s. We don't know who they are
Yes.
because they were not documented.
Mm-hmm.
because they were Portuguese citizens of color,
Mm.
so they didn't really matter. I
Mm.
know that there was also Haitians in Hawaii,
Yes.
um, in the 1930s as well, because there was also a lot of Haitian sailors.
Yes.
And um, I know that the events of, you know, there's also, of course, the Puerto Rican migration or
Yes.
immigration to Hawaii. But
Yes.
then again, because they were a colony and they were people of color, we don't have a lot of documentation on the names of those people that arrived.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like a problem with having a white focus history, is
Yes.
that it's
Mhm.
white focused, so we don't know these people. You don't
Yes.
know their stories a lot of times unless some white person wrote it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, and I wish that actually there were more people of color writing about history
Yes.
and
Mhm.
doing more oral histories, because that's the only way we're going to be able to dig up these types of mo'olelo, these types of stories.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And, for example, with the Black community, there's a thinking with many Hawaiians that the Black community is something that is recent, um, that came about through the military. And that's because today, most of the Black community in Hawaii, for 85%, are military related. But that's
Yes.
Mhm.
today's Black community.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the Black community that historically has been in Hawaii
Right.
Yes.
since the time of Kamehameha the First. There's
Mm-hmm.
been a Black community in Hawaii for the last 200 years. And we
Yes.
Mhm.
have to also recognize that as well. In fact, the Black community in Hawaii in the 18 in the early part of the 20th century was located near Kaka'ako, where there's now luxury condos.
Mm.
Mhm.
So, there's that whole erasure of all of these histories. And like for me,
Yes.
um, Hawaiian history is the history of Hawaiians, of course. But there's also a Hawaii history,
Mm.
which is the history of all of these people, these um, diverse communities coming to Hawaii and sharing their culture in Hawaii, as well as, unfortunately, sharing oppression as well,
Yes.
because of especially the sugar plantations, which
Mm-hmm.
is a very horrible history that I think we sanitize way too much,
Yes.
because they were basically slaves. And they
Yes.
modeled the sugar plantations after cotton plantations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Thank
you
you.
know, so I mean, we're celebrating like when we're talking about immigration, the history of these immigrant groups, like 1907 Filipinos arrived. We failed to mention that we're actually celebrating labor trafficking.
Yes. Yes.
So, I mean, yeah, but that's again something that comes from our American education, just like how we celebrate Martin Luther King Day, as if that's the end of the Black Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah.
Right.
We celebrate movements because we want them to end. That's the
Mhm.
American
Mm.
mentality.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
um yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the like that it was essentially akin to slavery because what I was going to ask you is how I'm sure you know this, but I'm going to ask anyway, in terms of like blackbirding. Like blackbirding is something I didn't know about until I would say a couple years ago. And I was like, what is that? And it was essentially the Polynesian slave trade. So
Mm-hmm.
um, when we talk about, you know, the way I look at it is like I try to like look at the dates and try to see like, okay, this is what was happening here, but like what is the global perspective of the other events that were going on, which can explain, the diversity of our that we've seen like throughout our history. So that's not just the military ones, right? Like
Yeah.
that these people have been here forever. Well, not forever, but for a very long time, right? It's not a new thing. Um, how has your research, how much have you researched blackbirding and that effect on the Pacific Islander community?
Mm.
So blackbirding wasn't necessarily a Polynesian slave trading. It was Pacifica, and actually the worst impacted places were in Melanesia and in
Mm-hmm.
Micronesia. Um, the term Kanak or Kanaka in Australia today still refers to Pacific Islanders who were blackbirded
Mm-hmm.
because they couldn't think of another word. The name Kanaki for New Caledonia comes from the Hawaiian word Kanaka
Mm-hmm.
because, again, of the blackbirding experience, that was the only name as Pacific Islanders they were known by, so they adopted it as their name of the whole country. Um, there's certain things within Hawaiian history. There's certain things within history that if I research too long about it, it actually gives me nightmares.
Yeah.
Some of that is like, for example, the Japanese
Mm-hmm.
occupation of China, like the rape of Nanking.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Horrible histories. Blackbirding and the Atlantic slave trade are two other histories that
Yes.
are horrible histories.
Mhm.
Um, but we need to talk about these horrible histories because they fed into institutions that we still have today.
Mhm.
So,
Yes.
with blackbirding, blackbirding actually began at the same time that the British had banned slavery in their other colonies, but they banned it in Africa.
Yep.
So, Australia, which was an emerging colony, and mostly Australia, um, and other plantations within Tahiti and Hawaii. We also engaged in blackbirding in Hawaii.
Mhm.
So there's these blackbirders. They're called blackbirders because well, the first enslaved people were from Melanesia, particularly from Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, that area, and they were called blackbirds because to call them humans would be to humanize them.
Mhm.
So they called these humans blackbirds. The ones who enslaved the blackbirds were blackbirders. Again, horrible history.
Mm.
So they began scooping up um, from Fiji, from Vanuatu, from Solomon Islands, and then they also moved into Samoa, parts of Outer Tonga. They moved into also Micronesia. Like, for example, in Kosrae, um, a lot of the women were blackbirded. And by the time that Hawaiian missionaries arrived in Kosrae, which is in Micronesia, there was less than 500 Kosraeans left on the island out of a population of, I think the pre contact population was 10,000.
Wow.
We don't know the numbers of all these people that were enslaved. And yeah, and Hawaii, we also had our share of plantations buying blackbirds from these blackbirders illicitly because they could not legally do that because slavery was banned in Hawaii, but they
Mhm.
did it anyway. Um, and from our case in Hawaii, we stole people, the sugar plantation stole people, mostly from Micronesia.
Mm.
And we don't know their names again because this was an illicit trade. But we know in cases like in Australia, and especially in Australia, which is more documented, these were several thousand. I mean, there's a story about a Samoan village that the people slept, and while the people were sleeping, these blackbirders raided and stole the entire village. And that also happened in parts of what was then called the Gilbert Islands, which is known today as Kiribati. Kiribati. And I mean, the horror of that. And the other thing we need to remember is that the blackbirding was slavery. it was
Mhm.
labor trafficking, but
Yes.
there was also sex trafficking because some of these women were sold into brothels,
Yes.
um, or sold as sex slaves. And that's also another history that we need to also talk about as well. Some of these women, these Pacific Islander women, actually were sold into brothels in the United States, in the wild, wild West,
Yes.
in Mexico, um, and also in China as well. And that's why sometimes when people do their DNA tests, they have this random Pacific Islander blood DNA. And that's because sometimes there's was an ancestor who was blackbirded
Mm.
and they wound up there, being sold over there. And you know, Rapa Nui or Easter Island, uh, most of their population was like blackbirded uh, to Peru and to Chile to work in mines, and many of them died.
Mm.
So, I mean, imagine being in a community where one hand you're facing introduced foreign diseases,
Yes.
then on the other hand, you're also facing being kidnapped in the middle of the night and sold off and working your being forced to work yourself to death.
Yes. Yeah, like I read, I can't remember which book it was. It's behind me somewhere, but the the ones who were kidnapped from Rapa Nui and forced to work in those mines, like they didn't even live like 6 months from when they hit the shore.
Yeah.
Like it was just heartbreaking. When I read these stories. But I'm glad that we're able to bring them to light.
Mhm.
Perhaps when I'll do some mini series on that book, but
Yes.
it's essentially like it's written by a white person, but it was like the letters you know, captured by, I think it was a captain on a ship that was involved in the trafficking. Um, but like reading, it's obviously written in his point of view, but when I'm reading it myself, I have I have centered on the indigenous experience within this thing, and I'm just like, this is ridiculous. This is it's unbelievable, really.
Yes.
Um, so mahalo for sharing.
Mm.
I know it's a heavy topic, and we have to
Yes.
end on that heavy topic, but but yeah, just mahalo for sharing that, because I feel like that's something that we should be talking about more, especially that our own community needs to be educated upon, because a lot of the I guess the perspectives that, like you said, were centered in white supremacist views or talking points.
Yes.
um, they also need to understand that, like, they have ancestors and people who are treated very much the same way. So for you to treat, or people that you don't know just because of their skin color, to me
Yes.
it's like spitting on your own ancestors. So um, yeah, I don't know what else to say about that, but I know I love my ancestors and I will do everything that I can to honor them. So mahalo.
Mhm.
So let's see. Oh, we are already at the time. So let's end it on a good note.
Yes.
Tell us one thing that you are super proud of about Hawaii today and the progress that we're making in these different areas, and what encourages you about our future.
Sorry, I have to. I literally have to think about that.
No, it's okay.
Like, because I think one of the things that is encouraging in terms of trends in Hawaii is that more and more Native Hawaiians are getting college degrees and
Yes.
becoming educated. Um, and see more youth also speaking out against injustices and getting more familiar with issues such as,
Mm,
with Black Lives Matter,
Mhm.
with the anti-Micronesian discrimination and things like that. So I so that's encouraging that the youth are taking more of a mantle of
Mhm.
leadership,
Yeah.
and I hope that they don't get corrupted.
Yes,
Right. Let us protect them, please.
yes,
But yes, and also the fact that more Hawaiians are getting those the pala pala, the
Yes,
degrees. So that's good.
that's awesome. I'm glad you touched on that because I was talking on a panel, inside my organization and sharing that, like my mother was the first person of our family to get her degree, and my sister and I were the second and the third. So we're super proud to be like part of the ones who are,
mhm,
trying to expand and lift up our statistics, which are not always great. And, just trying to create spaces and opportunities for the youth to continue to do that. So mahalo nui for that. Um, so yeah, thank you so much for sharing with us. I absolutely know that we are going to have you back. I would love to
yes,
whenever, hopefully you have time, in our upcoming panels or having another follow-on interview and we can talk
yes,
about specific issues. But for those who may not even know like where to find you and your wealth of information, where's the best place for them to find you online?
yes,
The best place would be right now. So I have a website, www.adamkeawe.com. That's one. But those are like my older blog entries. For newer stuff, IG would be a good place. And my IG handle is at Adam Keawe. That's also my Twitter handle, but Twitter is more my political stuff, not so much history. Um, and then there's also Facebook, but to be honest, I'm trying to phase out my Facebook. So yeah, there's that.
Okay, right on.
mhm,
Yes, guys, definitely check out his Twitter, absolutely. And yeah, his Instagram is great too. I repost some of his things, not nearly as much as I need to, but definitely check out Keawe.
yes,
We are blessed and honored to have your mana'o and your bravery as part of our community. So thank you so much.
yes.
Dana,
Thank
last
you for
words.
having me.
Sure.
Yes, we're very excited that you came upon. I know like Moana said earlier, we only hit the very tip of the iceberg of all the knowledge and information you have because whenever Moana would share something of yours, I literally have a safe place on Facebook that I made a photo called Minority History. And I put it all in there and I share it with my friends so they can see it and they can continue to get educated and continue spreading that knowledge because it's too often we have like you said the whitewash what was a term someone in my family called they called the Disney version of of history. It's
Yes.
all the pretty birds and singing and Hawaii offered food and said yes I would like to be part of the country and all that kind of stuff. We have to change that narrative that has been misinterpreted and mistold for so many years. So thank you so much for being that advocate for the island of Hawaii and many other cultures to give a voice for the voiceless and the ones that did not have a chance to say their part in history. So thank you.
Alrighty, guys. Thank you for tuning in and listening, whether you're live or on the replay. Please be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube and on Twitch. And for the playbacks, you can find us on all podcast platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, all the good things. You can find us there. Weekly on Thursdays is our live streams, and then on the podcast platforms on Tuesdays.
Yes.
So mahalo nui, everyone. We hope that you all enjoyed. Take care, be good to one another, and we will see you next time.